I'm sure everyone here is familiar with the old proverb that precaution is better than cure, or better safe than sorry. Or as Ben Franklin articulated it, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. We have so many sayings like that, and I was looking it up. These proverbs, these idioms are in almost every language on earth. And we're constantly counseled to take precautions to prevent harm. Currently, with the flu raging throughout the United States, you hear warnings: wash your hands, if you're sick, stay away from people, and so forth. Because the basic idea is that it is better to prevent harm than try to deal with the consequences of something after it occurs. Today, I'd like to speak to you about the dual principles of the precautionary principle and the principle of pollution prevention. They really sort of go together. And I want to relate those two concepts to the Superfund cleanup and the restoration activities that are occurring in Butte at the present time. What I intend to do is really three things. One, I want to define with some precision the precautionary principle and the principle of pollution prevention. Then I want to show how these two principles directly apply to Superfund remediation and restoration. And then finally, what I want to do is look at some specific cases in Butte where they should apply and see to what extent they are being applied. The area of the forthcoming health study, the Montana pole plant cleanup, the Westside priority soils area, particularly the area in the flat, and finally a little bit about the Berkeley pit. So, let's look at the meaning of the precautionary principle and the principle of pollution prevention. I want to define, first of all, the term precaution. It's not an esoteric term. It means caution that is applied forthsightedly, action taken to avoid some evil. And prevention means to act before the harm occurs. And I want to base the presentation this afternoon on three, what I think are fundamental axioms or principles. First, that all harms cannot be made whole. All harms cannot be made right. Not all harms can be remediated or restored. Second, that it is unethical, or it's plain wrong, to have someone experience a harm that could have reasonably been prevented. And third, it is often difficult to establish strict causality, and I'll get to that one throughout the talk this afternoon. The point I want to make is that Superfund is supposed to deal with threatened risk and threatened harm. And so the precautionary principle should apply, pollution prevention should apply, and when I get into some of the rules and regulations governing Superfund, I'll see it does apply and should be applied to those sites I just mentioned. But first, let me go into greater depth about what is meant by the precautionary principle and the principle of pollution prevention. The essence of the precautionary principle is that government should act before harm to human health and the environment occurs from the release of toxic substances. The precautionary principle dictates that indication of harm rather than proof of harm should be the trigger for action. If there is a reasonable suspicion that harm to human health and the environment could occur from the release of a toxic substance, government should step in and fix the problem before it hurts people and the environment. The Wingspread statement on the precautionary principle states, when an activity raises threats of harm to human health or the environment, precautionary measures should be taken, even if some cause and effect relationships are not fully established scientifically. The former EPA Director Christine Todd Whitman stated, policymakers need to take a precautionary approach to environmental protection. We must acknowledge that uncertainty is inherent in managing natural resources. Recognize it is usually easier to prevent environmental damage than it is to repair it later. And shift the burden of proof away from those advocating protection toward those proposing an action that may be harmful. This may not sound important, but in a lot of cases the burden of proof in effect rests with citizens to prove the harm instead of the agency or the industry to prove the safety. The point is that if there is a strong suspicion that something bad is going to happen, government has an obligation to stop it prior to its occurring. And as I said, it's grounded in that old statement, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So even in the face of scientific uncertainty, society should take reasonable actions to avert risk where the potential harm to human health or the environment is thought to be serious or irreparable. And this principle has found a warrant in case law. You may recall that a number of years back, the Environmental Protection Agency banned lead in gasoline. And this was challenged in court in the Ethel Corporation versus the U.S. EPA. And the EPA decision to ban lead was challenged, but the court supported the banning of leaded gasoline by the EPA. And this was really an example of the precautionary principle in action because the court held that it was right for the U.S. EPA to take a decision banning lead and to take a precautionary approach in doing so, even in the absence of scientific evidence adequate to demonstrate exactly that the risk from lead were or what the benefits of removing it would be. Of course, as it turned out, banning lead from gasoline has led to a profound improvement in lead exposure problems in the United States. And it's contributed to the virtual elimination of lead from air, and it's significantly decreased lead in children's blood. Without going into all of them, there are also all sorts of international treaties and conventions to which, at least at the present time, the United States is still a signatory that endorses the principle of pollution prevention and the precautionary principle. All right, enough on what is the precautionary principle in pollution prevention. Now I want to take it into the area of Superfund remediation and restoration. As I said before, Superfund is supposed to deal with threats or risks posed by contamination. In the case of Butte, it's by over a century of mining activities that left lead, cadmium, mercury, and other contaminants here in Butte. The Superfund purpose is to ameliorate, remediate, or prevent actual or potential threats to human health and the environment emanating from toxic material or hazardous material. And that's not my statement, that's the EPA's statement of what its own program is supposed to do. But I want to go beyond EPA and look very briefly at Montana law. Why am I doing that when I'm talking about a federal program? A couple of reasons. One, the EPA is supposed to incorporate state standards for pollution remediation into the Superfund process, particularly if those state standards are more stringent than the federal standards. And we also have a situation here in Butte, I mentioned the pole plant, where the lead agency is the Montana Department of Environmental Quality, and the EPA is providing support for what's going on there. What's interesting so what's relevant to Montana law is relevant to the Superfund cleanup and remediation in Butte. Article 2, Section 3 of the Montana Constitution provides that all persons are born free and have certain inalienable rights. These rights include the right to a clean and healthy natural environment. And Article 9 of the Montana State Constitution states, the state and each person shall maintain and improve a clean and healthful environment in Montana for present and future generations. And if you look at the Montana Department of Environmental Quality's mission statement, and I quote, to protect, sustain, and improve a clean and healthful environment to benefit present and future generations. Now, there was an important court case in Montana dealing with the meaning of that section of the Constitution. And stepping back a minute, that environmental protection in Montana's Constitution is unique in state constitutions in the United States. But anyway, in a case that I actually, because I was on the board then, the Montana Environmental Information Center versus the Montana Department of Environmental Quality and the 7-Up Pete joint venture, that was a mine, the Montana Supreme Court found that the state constitution, the sections I just read, mandate pollution prevention and the precautionary principle, that these were part of Montana's guarantee to citizens of a clean and healthy natural environment. The court found, and I quote the decision, the right to a clean and healthful environment is a fundamental right. And in analyzing the discussion and debate at the Montana Constitutional Convention, the court determined that it was the clear intent of the participants that the environmental rights guaranteed in Articles 2 and 9 were interrelated, and that these two articles espouse the principles of pollution prevention and the precautionary principle. For the example, the court cited one of the delegates to the convention, McNeil, who said in discussing how Articles 9 and Article 2 were interrelated, they said it goes further than that and directs the legislature to provide remedies to prevent degradation. This is, the court said, anticipatory. It was also clear during the discussion and debate during the Montana Constitutional Convention that the delegates intended the environmental provisions of the Constitution to mandate an improvement of the natural environment. The court stated, in doing so, we conclude that the delegates' intention was to provide language and protections which are both anticipatory and preventative. The delegates did not intend to merely prohibit that degree of environmental degradation that can be conclusively linked to ill health or physical endangerment. Our Constitution does not require that dead fish float on the surface of our state's rivers and streams before its far-sighted environmental protections can be invoked. You can read the rest of the decision for yourself, but throughout there is the unequivocal statement, unambiguous statement, that the principles of pollution prevention and the precautionary principle or rule must direct the administration and implementation of all state laws, rules, and regulations, and that this will guide what the state of Montana does under Superfund. This may not sound important, but it is, because the federal government, although the United States Constitution does not directly guarantee the right to a clean and healthy natural environment, but the way the Superfund law is written, and I know this is a technical point, but it's important. Put it this way, the federal government, the EPA, has to respect and accommodate state law in the implementation of Superfund, or CERCLA is the title of the bill, cleanups and restoration in an area. And Montana law and the administration of Montana rules and regulations, the administration of the cleanup of Superfund sites, such as the Pole Plant, where the state is the lead agency, or other sites in Butte where the state is a participatory, which is every other Superfund site in Butte, has to be guided by the precautionary principle and the principle of pollution prevention, to prevent pollution before it occurs. So that's the reason for going into this. There's another way of looking at it, and I'll be quick because I want to allow some time for questions. But I wrote, not the Latin, first do no harm, but which is also another statement of the precautionary principle. But you see that ARARS. And if you're not familiar with Superfund, you may not be familiar with what that stands for. It stands for applicable or relevant and appropriate requirements. Okay, that's nice. That sounds bureaucratic. What that means is that in enforcing cleanup levels or cleanup standards, one of the primary criteria in designing and implementing a Superfund cleanup is that the Superfund cleanup has to be cognizant of and be guided by the ARARs that are in effect for a particular site or for a particular contaminant like arsenic, lead, cadmium, mercury, and so forth. Most of the time, these ARARs are given in quantifiable parts per billion, parts per million kinds of things. But I would make the argument to you today that we should have, and Superfund law countenances, a broader definition of what is an ARAR. It's not just a number. That ARARs do not have to be numerical standards that can be found in the law of the state. That's not my ruling. That is a ruling in the case of United States versus Axle Coating of America Incorporated. That you don't have to have numerical standards for something to be an applicable standard. The court said this: Superfund, or CERCLA, envisions a substantial and meaningful role for the individual states in the development and selection of remedial actions to be taken within their jurisdiction. Superfund also accommodates the environmental standards and requirements of the state in which a site is located. Congress has not displaced state regulations. And the EPA's own publication, Superfund Program Interim Guidance and Compliance and blah, 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 recognizes that requirements don't have to be specific numerical standards to be enforceable errors. General state goals that are duly promulgated, such as a non-degradation law, have the same weight, according to the EPA and the court, as do numerical standards. And again, that might not sound too profound, so what? But Superfund law itself defines an error as any standard, requirement, criterion, or limitation to be applied to a Superfund site. Okay, again, why is this important? I would criticize EPA, or maybe this part of it has been ignored, probably because it's easier to deal with quantifiable numbers. Has set up for each of these different toxics quantifiable standards, which, if we're meeting the standards, it's okay. If we're not meeting the standards, it's not okay. That's a very generalized statement, because where some of these standards come from, I remember about 5 years ago, the head of the Montana office of EPA was being questioned about where the arsenic cleanup standards came from. And where was the data supporting the numerical standards that were being used in Butte? Because Butte standards are different than the rest of the nations. They're different from Anaconda for the same thing. And then she hemmed and hawed and said, well, they're here, there. And then finally she made this statement, which I remember taking notes of. Well, EPA had an intuition of where they should be. Okay, that's good, and you know, but that certainly was not quantifiable. It didn't come down from Mount Sinai. There's a quotation that William Cameron says that not everything that can be counted counts, not everything that counts can be counted. And, you know, I think we need to keep that in mind. So, in the remaining 10 or 15 minutes, I want to go from this general discussion and give you my ideas, my reflections, my thoughts about how this all relates to what's going on in Butte now. And look at those sites that I talked about. The first one I want to talk about is the health study. Every few years, the record of decision for priority soils, okay, priority soils is the Butte area north of Front Street. Dr. Powell has done outstanding work working on the caps in the area with native grass seed mixtures that finally, after years of problems with the caps, I'm not saying they're totally problem-free now, but it's working. And so, you know, you really should be commended for the outstanding work you're doing on the caps in Butte. You know, and anyway, what's that?
I'm not alone.
No, nobody is ever alone, but, you know, I wanted to put that in there, which is true, you know. The point I'm getting at is that every so often you have to do, according to the record of decision for priority soils, a health study. What's the purpose of the health study? The health study is to find out, is Superfund protecting health? And one of the concerns that I have relates to the issue of environmental justice. And I'm going to get it to pollution prevention and the precautionary principle in a couple of minutes. But let me give you some background. The area of Butte, north of Front Street, the Butte Hill, has a disproportionately high number of low-income people compared to the state of Montana and compared to the nation. That would qualify Uptown Butte under what EPA calls an environmental justice site. The argument behind environmental justice, which at least through today is still policy with EPA, although there have been questions about whether that office will be removed, but it's still there today. And really, environmental justice is equal protection of the laws, that simply because you're low income or in other parts of the country because you're a citizen of color, you should not have to bear a disproportionately high toxics burden. And, okay, that would make the uptown area an environmental justice area. One of the things that I have been pushing for is that in conducting this health study, particular attention should be paid to the health effects of the toxics of concern, particularly arsenic, lead, and mercury, on low-income citizens who generally have poorer health than non-low-income citizens. They generally have less access to health care. They generally live in substandard housing compared to the non-poor. And so the argument that I would make is that shouldn't we look at the disproportionate effect of exposure to the toxics of concern on low-income citizens, because what may be a safe level of exposure for a non-poor person may not be safe for a poor person. And there's some evidence to support that, but it hasn't been quantified to a definitive degree. One of the expressions is the evidence is suggestive. And so EPA, and I've tried to get this and got nowhere because they've essentially said that, we can't quantify it. We don't know how. There doesn't exist the protocol for doing studies of the disproportionate effect of the toxics of concern on low-income citizens. We can't do it, so we're not going to worry about it. We're just going to assume that what's protective of one is protective of all. Again, that notion of, all right, maybe there isn't the degree of data to establish to a scientific certainty that there's a disproportionate effect. There's some data. I'm not saying it's totally devoid of data, but there isn't enough to satisfy the EPA. But I would argue that if they were true to the meaning of the precautionary principle, pollution prevention, and everything else I've been talking about, they ought to assume that there's a disparate effect and go from there. For example, they're using tumor registries as the basis of a lot of their data. The problem I have with tumor registries is that you go to St. James, you're diagnosed with cancer, you get in the tumor registry. But a lot of low-income people compared to non-low-income people don't go to doctors. They don't go to hospitals. They have cancer, but they don't go because they can't afford it. And I have known people in Butte who have not gone for health care because they didn't have the money to pay for it, which I think is problematic in and of itself, but they wouldn't be counted. All right, that's the health study. The second one I would go into is the Montana Pole Plant. All right, that's by the interstate thing over there. The Montana Pole Plant has been in the process of being cleaned up for years. And one of the toxics of concern out there that worries me is dioxin in the soil. Dioxin has, I think justifiably, a bad rep in that the EPA and other agencies, the World Health Organization, maintain that there are no safe levels of exposure to dioxin. An EPA report in 2012 concluded that after reviewing mounds of evidence, there are potentially serious effects of dioxin at even, as they put it, ultra low levels of exposure to dioxin. Other scientific studies have linked dioxins to cancer, disrupted hormones, reproductive damage, and a whole list of things. And the EPA studies have found that serious health effects occur from parts per trillion exposure to dioxin. And so no wonder dioxin is considered to be one of the most toxic substances known to human beings. Love Canal, which was the kind of the issue that started Superfund, Lois Gibbs, that was dioxin. The active ingredient in Agent Orange was dioxin. And so the precautionary principle, the principle of pollution prevention, Montana law that I've cited, federal law, I would argue requires more than capping, fencing, and declaring off limits the dioxin at the Montana Pole Plant. Superfund is supposed to clean up in a permanent way that reduces the toxicity, mobility, and volume of contaminants to protect human health. Capping doesn't do any of that. And the precautionary principle to me would mandate removing that stuff and either incinerating it or getting it out of the soil, because it will be left there as a perpetual threat to human health. Let me give you two more quick ones. Westside priority soils. Now, Westside priority soils used to be called non-priority soils, and that's a great name. It currently consists of the area west of Tech, where people shoot their guns and everything, and the area up northwest of Tech. The argument that's being made, and EPA actually said they would do this, is that they also ought to take a look at the area of Butte called the Flat. Why? Very quickly. A lot of the arsenic contamination that you find in attics came from the Anaconda smelter or came from smelters on the Butte Hill. There was one smelter in the Flat, but most of it came from that you see if you live uptown and you have arsenic, came from the Anaconda smelter or from some smelters operating on the Butte Hill. Why in the world would any rational person think that the contaminants blowing in from Anaconda would come into Butte, get to Front Street and say, oh, we can't go beyond that, stop. But the EPA refuses, at least at the present time, to do a comprehensive, thorough, scientifically valid analysis of the attics for arsenic and Westside priority soils. Currently, a homeowner, if they want, can contact the Residential Metals Abatement Program, have their attic sampled, and if arsenic is found to be above action levels, it will be remediated. I want to say one thing parenthetically about the Residential Metals Abatement Program. That is a program that was undertaken a number of years back. I'm not sure exactly how many. It is held up to be a major success story that has received national recognition for lead cleanup primarily. That I've gone to conferences and explained what RMAP, Residential Metals Abatement Program, is doing, and people at the how in the world did you people ever get that kind of program? It's phenomenal. It has great people working for it. It has really made a difference in Butte. On the Butte Hill, lead levels have dropped as a result of it, and it's free. They'll come in and sample your home, and then they'll clean it up. That, to me, should be proactively extended to Westside. Westside, first of all, find out what the problem is, not just anecdotal data, and then secondly, give additional funding, personnel, whatever's needed, expand the RMAP program there. Final thing I want to mention very quickly, Berkeley Pit. I don't want to say too much about the Berkeley Pit, but the one thing to remember, because it is the symbol of Superfund in Butte, it's hard to miss the pit. And the current water treatment, in a few years, the pit will reach what's called the critical water level when the aquifer's gone. And they're going to have EPA is calling for a perpetual water treatment plant. Again, pollution prevention and the precautionary principle that they're cutting it awfully close in the implementation and construction of that water treatment system, if there's any problem, we could really run into big-time troubles. Going back to Westside, the reason I say it's pollution prevention and the precautionary principle is we don't know. Let's find out and then address it. Those are 4 areas in Butte that I think, not just as a good piece of public policy, but under federal law and state law, should be addressed to take into account and implement the principle of pollution prevention and the precautionary principle. One other thing, then I'll throw it open for comments, questions, whatever. I worked with Robert Moeller of the EPA to design a brochure to help families and individuals stay safe in an environment that has the toxics that exist in Butte, to be contaminant smart, to be contaminant safe, that there are precautions that people can take to keep themselves safe and to keep their children safe. It also discusses in greater detail the RMAP program, and if you own property and have not had your property sample, call them. They're great. It's a great program. Take advantage of it. There are other things that people can do in terms of stormwater runoff issues, construction issues, remodeling issues. And my wife Roberta now is going to distribute the brochure that I prepared with Robert Moeller of the EPA. I did the text and he provided the graphics and found the money somewhere for printing. It is not an official EPA document, I have to say that, because if it was an official EPA document that went through all the channels of approval, we would long be in Mount Moriah or Holy Cross Cemetery before the brochure ever came out. But it's relatively non-controversial and provides, I think, some good tips. It's been particularly targeted for the environmental justice community on the Hill, and I have just found out a couple of weeks ago that a similar brochure now, we're going to do one for Anaconda, which has its own problems. We're doing a presentation next month in Dillon, and so forth. So, you know, and if you would like more brochures, I have a venue for distribution, let me know, because I still have, we've distributed close to 6,000 brochures in Butte now, but I still have boxes of them, you know.
It's exactly as many as the people with.
Well, I knew that. See, I had a mystical intuition of the number, and, you know, I quantified it and it turned out right. Anyway, you said 40 minutes, I went to 41, but the previous instructor was a minute late. Yes?
I appreciate you bringing